Good morning, everybody. Is this on? Good morning. If everybody could please take a seat, that would be great. Thank you. Good morning. It's great to see you all here. Thank you for being here. I'm Alan Kornberg, and on behalf of the Board of Trustees, a very, very warm welcome to all of you. I hope you're enjoying family weekend and the time with your child and catching up on things. And I hope all of you made it to one of the faculty sessions this morning rather than eating grilled donuts at the Blue Bend Diner, which I did yesterday morning. We're here to talk about Bennington today, which is obviously the title of our session, but we really can't talk about where we are without understanding where we came from and, of course, where we want to go. As you probably know, Bennington was founded in 1932, a very precarious time to start a college, with the vision that it would fill a gap in the landscape of higher education. It would offer a progressive, experience-based education, at the time for women only, but it aimed to push the boundaries of what was currently available to students and to be at the cutting edge. Our peer institutions actually were very, very supportive of this effort because they knew the field of higher education needed Bennington. Let me give you examples. As you probably know, Bennington was the first to include the visual and performing arts as equal disciplines to others in a liberal arts education. And as you know, peer institutions followed suit quite widely. We required every student every year to take a midwinter period working off campus. In my day, it was called the non-resident term, and now, of course, it's called field work term. And this was to inform their academic pursuits and to facilitate the learning of essential skills not taught in the classroom. Our faculty members are and always have been teacher practitioners, and our curriculum was designed to be elastic and to respond to faculty and student interests. And perhaps most importantly, students were, are, and will be expected to be the drivers of their own education. And so with these radical new offerings and radical new approach, Bennington began. In the 85 years since, we've built an incredible legacy. Our alumni, students, and faculty include change makers, culture shapers, and groundbreakers of every stripe. Since the beginning and throughout, we've attracted the kinds of thinkers, artists, experimenters who have made the campus the site of collective discovery and perennial innovation. We have our share of household names who developed their work here. The food writer Michael Pollan, who I'm sure many of you read, Judith Jones, the legendary editor who passed away recently, who championed Julia Child and rescued the Diary of Anne Frank from the reject pile. And, no secret to Game of Thrones fans, the actor Peter Dinklage, to name a few. But beyond cultivating brilliant, ambitious, entrepreneurial individuals, there is the power of this community. That being in an environment of people doing interesting work brings out the best in everyone. Bennington played a prominent role in many movements within mid-century modernism, with faculty like artists Paul Feely, Jules Olitsky, Pat Adams, Sir Anthony Caro, Kenneth Noland, David Smith, and others. Clement Greenberg, the critic, was a frequent lecturer and guest. Alumni like Helen Frankenthaler, class of 49, Cora Cohen, class of 64, and Maren Hessinger, 69, began their creative lives here on this campus. And noted authors Donna Tartt, Bret Easton Ellis, Jonathan Lethem, and Jill Eisenstadt, often called the literary Brat Pack, were all students here together in the mid-'80s. We've been talent spotters, bringing in notable thinkers and luminaries of every discipline, often before the rest of the world has caught on. The poet E.E. Cummings gave his first public reading at Bennington. Author Ralph Ellison gave his first public talk, and Jackson Pollock had his first retrospective here. The students organizing concerts on the third floor of Commons building booked an unknown singer named Bob Dylan for his first public performance in 1961. He came back in 1963 and shared with the student literary and art publication Silo, still published today, lyrics to his yet-to-be-published new song, The Times They Are A-Changin'. I could go on, but I want you to hear from Mariko. Suffice it to say, Bennington's rich and vibrant tradition continues to this day, and we're very grateful that you are part of it. I studied music and social sciences here in the early 70s, not the most direct route to becoming a Wall Street lawyer. But I knew then, as I do today, that my years at Bennington were by far the most important educational experience of my life. I've remained engaged and committed, and now have the great privilege to lead the college's Board of Trustees. The most wonderful thing about leading the Bennington Board is that we share with the faculty, staff, and students, and hopefully parents as well, the responsibility to ensure that Bennington continues always to innovate and adapt, to continue to push on what a liberal arts education should offer in a very challenging and difficult time. Bennington is revolutionary by design. Every forward motion is also a reaffirmation of our core values and a reconnection to our illustrious roots. We reflect, as we asked our students to do, on the state of the college, on the current state of the world, and on the current state of higher education, on the world as it is and the future we want to build, and then we move from there. I'll hand this over to President Silver to talk more about what we're doing and, more importantly, why. But again, thank you very, very much for being here.
Thank you, Alan. It's nice to see so many familiar faces together with so many new ones. Welcome to those of you who are here for the first time, or maybe the first time after drop-off, which means it's the first time that you're paying attention to anything really around you. So I want to welcome you here today. And I just want to build a bit on some of the things that Alan said, and then we'll open it up in real Bennington style to Q&A, because conversation is always more interesting than being talked at or just talking at somebody. But Bennington was founded to respond to a need in the world. And while this talk is called Bennington Today, in my mind, it could or should equally be called The World Tomorrow. Because what I say to students when they come in to Bennington, and over again, is that Bennington education is designed to help students, graduates, not just survive in the world as they find it, but to make the world as they want it to be. No small task. It's hard enough to make one's life as you want it to be, let alone to make the world as you want it to be. But we want to engage students in that kind of thinking from the very beginning, especially in this moment. Now, of course, this has been part of Bennington's ethos from the beginning. It's how we teach, it's how we engage students, it's how our students make work. But this is a particularly contentious time, right? And I say that without partisanship or commentary on who or what or where. I think we can all agree that this is a time in which we are having a hard time talking to one another and working together to design the future, to design the world as we want it to be. And maybe design isn't even the right word. Design implies that you're kind of hovering above it all and you're going to draw the map or draw the picture and everyone's going to fall into line. In fact, it really is about the kind of direct human-to-human engagement that happens here at Bennington, which is how work is made. At Bennington, we talk a lot about the individual student, the individual student's plan, the ways in which, with no majors, by design, we help students, support students to engage the things that matter to them so that they can even start to think about what is the world as they want it to be. Because despite the fact that, if you'll excuse me, some of you are students in the room, many 17-year-olds may think they know exactly the world as they want it to be. In fact, hopefully what they find out, at least in the 4 years here and beyond, and I'll say this for myself, a few years out of college, you learn things along the way. Right? You learn that your idea of the world as you wanted it to be maybe when you were 17, 18, 19, 20, 39, 40, right, is not maybe exactly what you thought. You're integrating new information, new perspectives, new ideas along the way. And as you're doing that, you are creating things. You are exercising those ideas out in the world. That's what Bennington students learn to do. And to my mind, quite frankly, that's what all students should learn how to do. So when I think about Bennington's original radicalness, if you will, radicalness, and I say that not in the political sense, but within the context of its sector, right? Within the context of higher ed. As Alan said, bringing the arts in to be co-equal with the rest of the liberal arts was radical. Now it's not so radical, but it was radical. Having no majors still is actually quite radical. Focusing on the student as the center of the education, but the student as part of a community. Right? The student as an individual, but the student as part of an active community building process still is kind of radical. And it can feel radical sometimes to our students when they get here and we tell them, no, you have to make some of these decisions. And this is in part because they're 17 or 18 or 19, but it's in part because this is what they need to be able to do in the world. So when we think about Bennington and we think about the education we provide, we don't think only about the world that we want to make. We think about engaging our students in filling out the idea of the world that they want to make, but doing it in a way that is fluid, doing it in a way that integrates new information and perspectives all the time. So if your students are first years, they are just coming up that ramp where their work starts to get hard. Isabel Roche, who's the provost and dean who's here, said the other day, you may hear from some of the first years, it's not as hard as I thought it was. Wait. Wait a couple weeks. Right? We're in the part where they're starting to get exposed to new ideas, they're finding their way, and then they have to produce. And getting over that hump of having to produce is a challenge. And that, I will say, is a challenge by design. And you might be starting to hear about fieldwork term. You might be starting to hear about going out in the real world, right? Where they came from, by the way, right? But going out in the real world, finding a job, figuring out what they want that experience to be, and hopefully, with our help and in many cases with your help, thinking about what they want to get out of that experience. Not just what they want to say they got out of that experience, but what they really deeply, genuinely want to learn through fieldwork term. And if your students are second years, you might be starting to hear a little bit more about the plan. And having my own advisees and having watched a number of students go through the plan process, it is both invigorating and stressful, can be anxiety-inducing and exciting all at the same time, because it is the first time when they are really asked to say, why are you here? And for us, the question, why are you here, is not what major do you want to undertake, what do you want to do to satisfy us? Why are you here is about who you want to be in the world. Right? And that doesn't have to be static or concrete, but it's the beginning of that exploration. As now adults, of asserting their own direction, starting to chart their own path, even if that path may change dramatically, not only over the course of the time that they're here, but even as they go out into the world. Right? Most of you probably know by now that most people graduating from college today, tomorrow, for the next foreseeable future, let's just say, are not going to move into one company, one nonprofit, one organization, stay in that organization, doing job after job, moving up the ladder. Some of the people going into the workforce today may not even be able to describe to you, when they're in the midst of it, something that sounds or feels to those of us who are a little older like a traditional career. What kind of work you do will be about both what you're doing in the moment and all of the things that you've learned along the way, but it may not fit into the kinds of boxes that we are all used to. Even they, the students, are somewhat used to. And yet the world they're entering into is not organized into those boxes anymore, or if it is for a few people. People will still become doctors. Right? People will still become faculty members. People will still take some of the traditional paths in life that require a kind of linear focus. But even within those, let's take a doctor or a faculty member, they may move around among disciplines in ways that really didn't exist as a pathway before. So we need to teach them how not just to survive in the world as they find it, but to make the world as they want it to be. So when we think about Bennington today, we think about the world tomorrow. And we think about the world tomorrow, too, because, in fact, we really want them to be conscientious, thoughtful, engaged world builders because the rest of us have to live in that world, too, right? We want them to be thinking and working together and thinking and working with us about the world as they want it to be. So how do we do this? We engage them from the very beginning to think about the whys of their education, not just the whats and the hows. Yes, we want them to learn things. We want them to learn facts and figures, ideas that other people have had. But we want them to learn how to do things, how to make things, how to generate and create, how to think in ways that people before them might not have thought. And this is something that Bennington is very practiced in doing, as you hear from Alan's list of illustrious alumni. But without that why, they're not going to be able to handle all the things that the world throws at them. So we focus on the why of their individual education, the why of education, period, why they're all here together, individually and collectively, what they can get out of it. So I know that sometimes this can be hard on parents. This can be hard on parents because Uncle Joe says, "What's Alice majoring in?" You say, "Well," right? And then there's Thanksgiving dinner, right? And there's Tallulah, and Aunt Sally says, "So what are you studying?" She says, "Well, I've got these 15 things, and I think I'm going to do this, and I think I'm going to do that." And in part, that is because they are describing, in some sense, the world of the future, which can be very uncomfortable sometimes for those of us who live in the present. But what we want to help students to understand how to do is how to engage directly the present, how to live in the present, how to work with the challenges of this present moment, even as they're thinking about the world as they want it to be, even as they are thinking about that future, not just their own, but the future for all of us. So with that, I'm going to stop talking at you. Alan and I would love to talk with you. I'm just going to introduce a couple of additional people who are in the room. For those of you who have specific individual questions about something to do with your own child, not that you can't ask those questions here in the wider forum, but if you wish. I want to introduce Isabel Roche, Provost and Dean of the college. I'll just ask everybody to do some jazz hands. And Lori Kobik, Dean of Studies. So for them, if you have questions about the core elements of the academics here, they are your first go-to people. I also want to introduce Faith McClellan, Director of Fieldwork Term. I can anticipate some of the questions you might have for Faith. And also Zania Markowitz, Dean of Students. Or as we like to call it, everything else. So thank you very much for being here today. I'm going to take a seat, and we'd love to take some questions. And I will just say that your children never hesitate to be the first to ask questions, so don't let them show you up. Please.
Right down there.
Yeah.
Oh, it's Kate.
Kate.
Let the back of the room start off the questioning. I noticed the entering class is about 20% international students. Is that? I'd love to know more about the radical, progressive vision of becoming a more international college. So,
is this okay? It's on. So I'll just address. There are lots of aspects to that question. I'll address two parts of it. One is that fundamentally, what we're hearing as we started to really travel intensively around the world, right, to meet parents and leaders and academic leaders, but also industry leaders around the world, is that more and more people want a Bennington education. More and more employers want graduates who have the skills that Bennington provides. For example, we know from fieldwork term employers and from alumni surveys that north of 90%, I think the real number is 94%, it's in here somewhere, of Bennington alums are deeply engaged in the work that they do in the world. Anybody know what the American national average is? Gallup did a poll recently of people who are engaged in their work. 22%. It's heartbreaking. Right? And if you're an employer, who do you want? You want somebody who is engaged in the work that they do. Right? You want somebody who is engaged in understanding the larger structure of which they're a part. Right? So when we think about international, a huge piece of this is very simple, right? It's demand. At the same time, when we think about opening up our institution, we've always had students from all over the world, as Alan can attest. But when we think about opening up our institution to a much wider range of perspectives, everyone will have a better education if we are more diverse and more inclusive, if more perspectives are part of the experience.
Yeah, I think it's obvious that in addition to offering something which is very important and unique, and certainly when you speak to students from other countries who have been in very rigid educational systems, for them Bennington is a revelation, and they're hugely enthusiastic. So we're doing something wonderful for them, and of course we're enriching the life on campus, which is a very, very important and wonderful goal.
Other questions?
Speak to the admission process and the typical kind of student that you're looking for, and give us a cross-section of the incoming class. Sure. And the best assets they have for you.
Mm-hmm. Sure. Some of the parents of first years may want to hear nothing anymore about the college admissions process, so I'll keep it brief and purge that from your mind. But I will say this, at Bennington a couple of years ago, we've always had an open admissions process that's really focused on the individual student, as those of you who've come and taken tours here know. We want to, and that's been true since the founding of the college, that it was always about meeting, and now sometimes it's by Skype or other ways, but meeting the individual student and talking to that student about what it is that that student wants to get out of the experience of higher education. And when I talk to our admissions officers before I go out on the road, I always tell them, I want any student who meets a Bennington admissions counselor to think about college differently, no matter where they go. If they go to, what's the biggest public now, Arizona State University, right? Or they go to University of Minnesota, they go to wherever. They go to Yale, they go to Stanford. I want them to think about what they want to get out of that experience and how they're going to navigate it differently because they encountered a Bennington person, even if they don't, for whatever range of reasons, come here. And I think that's essential to what Alan talked about, which is our role, frankly, in the higher education ecosystem, in the higher education landscape. In terms of what we're looking for from them, sometimes students show remarkable insight in their applications in the admissions process. That's a lot to ask. What we are looking for is someone who cares about their own education. Because if you are not committed to this process will not serve you. Right? We want students who are engaged. We want students who are thinking about themselves and thinking about the world, thinking about their communities in ways that are not just what was handed to them by somebody who might be a little older and grayer. Right? Some of that is good, I'm not discounting all of that, but that they are also thinking for themselves. That's really fundamentally what we're looking for.
And I think many of those students end up being people that love solving problems, and they're very entrepreneurial. Those are probably things that you can't necessarily test in a sort of conventional admissions process, but I think those are qualities that really distinguish Bennington students.
So it seems that inherent in the plan is this beautiful way of having students move toward what makes their heart sing. And with that passion in mind, how do you encourage them to go into diverse interests where it's maybe uncomfortable or it's something that they hadn't yet thought of pursuing?
Say that's where advising comes in, and it's also often where their peers come in. But I'll start with advising. So each student, as you all know, has a faculty advisor, and then as they move along in the process, they have a plan committee. The function of that advisor is manifold, and so is the function of that committee, but one of the principal things that happens in a plan committee meeting, so those of you who have second-year students, you may be hearing about this at Thanksgiving, one way or the other, or Christmas, if they have theirs after. But one of the principal things that happens is the student talks about, having written the essay and having had the faculty read the essay, they talk about what it is they want to do. They talk about what it is that makes their heart sing. And part of our job is then to say, for example, right, if battling climate change is what makes your heart sing, you should take some science, right? If battling inequality is what makes your heart sing, you should take some statistics. Ouch, right? And if making art is what makes your heart sing, you should take some writing courses because you're going to have to write grants. You're going to have to think about how you want to move your work through the world. And this is where, too, the capacities that we have begun to talk more and more with students about really come to the fore. Right? Their ability to form an inquiry, their ability to engage others in thinking through that inquiry, their ability to do research, their ability to make work, their ability to communicate about that work. Those are core elements of a Bennington education, no matter what you study. And it's also a tool for us to help students to be self-reflective about what is it they're really trying to accomplish and what do they need to do it. Because in the long run, what we want is students to be able to identify for themselves what's missing, right? For themselves, what they need to know. And I'll just talk for 1 second about an alum, Heather Dewey-Hagbor, who's an artist. She is a visual artist, and she decided that she wanted to make work that was informed by and informing the ways in which we use DNA. So she realized that she hadn't gotten a biology degree in any way. She graduated a number of years ago. The science had advanced, and she had gone to Bennington. And so she went out, and she learned what she needed to know. Right? She took courses. She was able to figure out not just that she needed to know something, what specifically within the vast field of what you can learn about DNA and how to separate genetic strands and things like this that I'm not fluent in. She figured out where to find it, who to study with, who she had access to as a non-traditional undergraduate and not somebody going to graduate school. Where could she find those courses? She lives in New York City, figuring out how to do that, how to get a grant in order to be funded to do that. And I just saw her work in a gallery in Tribeca, and she's come up here and spoken to students a number of times. She created these extremely creepy faces. So they are deeply creepy. So in the end, what she did, she lives in Brooklyn, and she, as you might have guessed, she lives in Brooklyn, and she stood on a street corner. She returned repeatedly to the same street corner and picked up the kinds of things we all leave behind. Hopefully less and less things like cigarette butts, but things like cigarette butts or drinking straws or strands of hair, Band-Aids, ew, gross, right? But things that people leave behind when they're not thinking. Right? She collected those things, hopefully wearing gloves. She collected those things. She had created a relationship with a lab in the city, and she used those things to extract bits of DNA. And then she created these. And for those of you who watch Game of Thrones, it really looks like the Hall of Faces or whatever, where she goes in and gets the faces. Anyway, this was before that. But she created these faces, and she does these shows that really engage people. It's visual art, right? But it really engages people in thinking about what kind of environment have we created? Right? What is this technology used for? What could this technology be used for? She's a fascinating, lovely person. She didn't come here thinking, I'm going to engage questions about DNA and genomics and the ways in which we can manipulate the genetic code and what we leave behind and privacy, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But when that spark hit her, she knew where to go. She figured out what to do, and she made it happen.
I would just add that there is an emphasis on experimentation. And experimentation not only in the classroom, but also think about field work term. It's an ideal time for a student to experiment There are so many stories of students that come here and say, you know, I had no interest in science whatsoever. I thought I was going to be a drama major, and I took a biology course, and I surprised myself and fell in love with it. And then, of course, there are stories. I heard one yesterday from a student who really was committed to being a scientist until she had a fieldwork term experience and worked in a lab and said, I love science. I really don't like the work of scientists. So experimentation is encouraged in multiple forms. And of course, that is a great, great advantage for Bennington students.
All the way in the back.
I'm just wondering, how do you factor in a student's objective strengths and weaknesses? How do you measure them along the way, and how important are they to you?
So just to repeat the question, the question is, how do we engage with, teach to, or around student strengths and weaknesses? How do we bring that into the plan process, for example? You didn't ask it that way, but is that fair? Okay. So that is absolutely another thing that comes out in these plan meetings. The way that the plan meetings work is the faculty advisor talks a little bit about the student with the plan committee. Often members of the plan committee have had the student in a class, not always, but often. A student comes in, have a conversation, the student leaves, we have another conversation, and then the advisor engages with the student over time to talk about what are the strengths and weaknesses, and also what does that student want to accomplish. We tend to talk about strengths and weaknesses in relation to what it is the student wants to do in the world, in part because we find that is more effective, rather than simply saying, here's something that you're not good at, right? In general, humans, if you say, there are some exceptions, but if you say, here's something you're not good at, humans will say, well, then I won't do that thing, right? In fact, what we want to talk to them about is what are they trying to accomplish and what do they need to get there? What do they need to build up in their own skill set in order to get there? And sometimes it takes the form of something very tangible, if you will, like take a statistics class, right? Or take an econ class, right? And sometimes, or take an art class, sometimes it's more nebulous and it really requires a conversation with the student, right? So I had an advisee some years ago who, really smart, capable, engaged student, really didn't like talking in class. And in fact, as the Bennington students and alums in the room can attest, talking in class is a big part of what happens here, right? And if you're not doing it, people notice, so then that's doubly like, oh, you know, but also it's a big part of what we want students to learn to be able to do, right? Is to engage ideas directly, to talk through questions and dilemmas and really engage the material. So you really have to talk in class. So I recommended that she take a dance or an acting class. First she took a dance class, then she took a drama class. Not because she's going to spend her life on stage, but because it enabled her to think in a focused way about using her voice. And by that I don't just mean the actual sound of her voice, but using her voice to express first maybe, in a sense, somebody else's emotions and ideas through a character, and then over time her own. So I think as advisors, we see it as incumbent upon ourselves to be creative with the student in engaging both the strengths and the weaknesses. And I'll just say one thing about strengths, and then if you have a follow-up, which is to Alan's point about science and experimentation and kinds of things that can happen in small classes and really pushing students. We don't grade on a curve, for the most part. You know, you might get a quiz or something where you're going to see where you are in relation, but for the most part, well, we use narrative evaluation. Students don't have to take grades, so the faculty are, from the beginning, engaging in a kind of assessment that is very different from the rating and ranking that you see at other places and that most students have experienced in high school. But it's also about then grading that particular student, right? Engaging in what is a strong performance for that student? What kind of feedback can we give even or especially to the strongest performers about how they can improve? Whereas if you grade on a curve and you're at the top there, right, you may not get a whole lot of feedback about how you want to improve. So it's thinking both about the weaknesses and about the strengths in relation to the individual student and what they want to accomplish. Did you have a follow-up question?
Sometimes it seems like passion can come from mastery, it can come after mastery. And I'm just wondering, is Bennington assuming that passion's a pre-existing thing? Because I know, there's no sort of area sequence requirements and the kind of thing that, forces kids to dabble and maybe find out things they might be good at that they don't know. So is it kind of, you're just assuming a pre-existing passion, or how does that work?
No, I would say, despite what I said in answer to the question about who do we admit, right? While on the one hand, we're not necessarily always looking for students, though it's equally great when we get those students who are already in a position of mastery around whether it's a language or an instrument or something else. We certainly get those students and we support those students and we engage those students. Sometimes the key for those students is to study more broadly. Sometimes it is for them to focus intently on the thing that they have already focused a great deal of their life on and to build around that. I think for us at the age of 17, 18, 19, we find that it is more educationally effective to engage the students in the things that interest them, but sometimes the interest is a kind of faint voice in the corner, right? It's not always the thing that's front and center for the student. And so part of our job as advisors is to help them to listen to all of those different things that they are hearing and feeling and seeing out in the world, right? That tiny inclination that maybe physics would be interesting for me, but I don't want to do that. It's like too much work. Then that's our job as the advisor, to pull them into that conversation, right? To help them to see the ways in which that could both augment the other things that they're interested in and build into something that actually could become a core pillar of what they do. And we see that happen all the time. But that's our job as advisors, is really to help them to understand and see all those signals. And in part, it's because we want them to be successful here, but much more importantly, it's because sometimes, even in grown-up life, right, it's those very faint signals that actually are the directive that's going to bring you to the next thing in your life. And so learning how to listen for that and how to think for that is a critical piece of what we hope they'll get out of being at Bennington. Mm-hmm.
Before you became the president.
Yes, you did self-identify as an alum and new parent. And if anything has surprised me, I would say the thing that has surprised me most is the strength of engagement and feeling that students and alums have about Bennington. I went to lots of wonderful schools. There are lots of things I feel strongly about and passionately about in my life. My schools are not among them, right? Maybe a particular faculty member, or maybe a particular experience. But the kind of formative experience that Bennington provides is far beyond anything I've seen anywhere else in higher ed. And I can talk a little bit more about why that is, but maybe Alan, you want to say something about that?
Yeah, one thing that we learned, certainly I did firsthand, in the search for Mariko was we had many, many conversations with people on and off campus. In fact, probably there may be people in the room that participated in some of those. And I would echo what Mariko said. The level of engagement and focus and intensity on the and it came from certainly from students who were very active participants in focus groups. Faculty could not have been more engaged to a person. Alumni were passionate because they recognize the specialness of this place and the role it had in their lives, even if they didn't necessarily graduate from Bennington. I literally would get calls constantly from people I had never met who would say, I want to talk to you about the search. It's really important. We have to get this right. Bennington is really important. And it was actually quite a dazzling experience because, as Mariko said, just the level of engagement and the care that people have and the affection, and not in a sentimental way, but in that this is an important institution. It was transformative in my life, and it has got to exist, and it has got to exist with great leadership that really understand the values of the institution. And that's just one other point I wanted to make. the thing that was astounding to me was the profound understanding of the core values of this place that was shared by everybody, from the staff that cleans the houses to the most senior faculty members and administrators, that there really is this common appreciation of the core values of Bennington and a deep belief that these are the right values for a liberal arts college.
What is in your mind, how do you see the work of Kappa, and what role does it play within the college?
We actually spent some time at the board meeting yesterday talking about this and the ways in which what happens in Kappa, what started really as a center, has what's the word I'm looking for? It really has permeated across the disciplines. It really has permeated the institution in so many ways. It doesn't mean that every course is a Kappa course, and I don't have my list here with me, but when I think about the ways in which Kappa and Kappa inspired or Kappa inflected courses and experiences help students to both engage the big, complex, knotty problems of the world and think about them in multifaceted and nuanced ways, but also to do that while, forgive the sort of sentimentality, but staring into the eyes of a whole bunch of other human beings, right? To do it in a way that is grounded in multiple lived experiences. So I have a public policy master's from a great institution. I never had to talk to anybody who might be affected by any public policy idea that I might have, right, as a 22-year-old. Never. But the idea that you would engage directly, both with your peers, your fellow students, but also with understanding the multiple experiences that people might have. So, for example, when I was in my public policy degree, we spent lots and lots of time talking about unintended consequences. We didn't talk to anybody who had to live with those unintended consequences. It's just not part of a traditional education. One of the things that Kappa brings and really amplifies, I think, throughout the Bennington experience is that both ability on the part of the students and the faculty and the skills that are required to think about real life problems in the round. Right? And to engage directly those who are most affected in the creation of both solutions, hopefully, but also even just ways of thinking about the problem in the first place. So just to give some examples, our neighbors over the border in New York, in Hoosick Falls, found that through much public advocacy, found that there was some chemical called PFOA in their water, which is a byproduct of making Teflon and a number of other things that we all rely on, in the water, in the drinking water there. There was some found closer to home in our neighborhood. There isn't any in the drinking water for the college. There isn't any in the drinking water for the town. But through Kappa, David Bond and others, together with a number of science faculty, really sprung into action. We got an NSF, I think it's called an emergency grant. It's called NSF Emergency, a rapid grant, fast, right? A rapid grant to engage students and community members directly in looking at this problem, understanding it, thinking about what could be done about it. Right? There's not a lot of good, directive, clear science around PFOA, and there had been very little, and when it existed, very poor engagement with the community around what were the community's real questions and concerns. And that was, a year and a half ago, 2 years ago? 2 years ago, thank you, Alex. 2 years ago. Since then, we've received a follow-on grant from the NSF to continue to do this work, to continue to engage students in doing this work. So during the course of this term and next term, Our students, with guidance from faculty, are doing house-to-house surveys here and in Hoosick Falls. We've had multiple students and faculty testify in the state legislature in Vermont and engaging legislators and in New York and people in the administration in New York State around both what is the problem and then what should be done about it. Right? How do we think about the problem? How much of it is about cleanup? How much of it is about adverse health outcomes? These things are incredibly complex, and also things like, why did it show up in the places that it showed up? Right? Here are the kinds of things that you can only find when you go out and talk to people. One of the things they found out is that the factory that was making some of the things that created PFOA, there was a guy, I don't know his name, right, who was tasked with getting rid of some of the various byproducts. He would just drive his dump truck around town and dump. This was many moons ago, right? He would just sort of dump it where he could find a place to put the dirt, where he could find a place to put that. And I'm oversimplifying here, but at first they were like, "Well, does this tell us something about the way the chemical moves around in the groundwater?" Actually, no. There's Joe in his truck, right? But if you don't talk to people, you don't know that, right? You could spend years going down the rabbit hole around the way the chemical moves around in the groundwater. But by going and talking to people and working with them face to face and understanding how the human system worked, students and faculty together were able to illuminate incredibly important things, yes, for science more broadly, for the good of mankind, but also for the people who live there. That's my very long-winded answer to your question. There's more to say. I could make it more long-winded, but I'll just stop. Yeah, and then you had a question. Go ahead.
Hi, so my name is Jonah, class of 2013. So I just wanted to ask you a question, which is a little bit, has some background in some psychology research on motivation, self-determination theory. So it's about intrinsic motivation, and it identifies 3 needs that help people to develop intrinsic motivation: autonomy, relatedness, and competence. And I think that we've spoken today about autonomy and competence quite a bit, how we measure, how we allow people at the school to have an individual choice in their education, how we then within that individual choice, how we measure their competence and their growth as a student, but about relatedness, about the interrelationships of students on campus, also with faculty and staff, and in the wider context, both in the academic context as well as the context, with regard to Kappa, just people engaging with the world. I was wondering if you could talk about the vision for how students are encouraged, or what the college is doing to encourage kind of a progressive, or in any case, what the thinking is about what sorts of relationships we're trying to develop on campus these days.
You mean within the student body, or
within the student body, but also students to faculty, students to staff, students to the wider context.
So there are aspects of this that are as they always were, right? Students live and work in small groups. They work together to create community standards within the houses in which they live, and that has all of the sometimes idealism and sometimes messiness that comes with human relations, right? Which is part of the deal. And then the small classes and engaging directly with faculty through the plan, having a faculty advisor as well as staff advising support. And then there are some new elements and layers to that. I would also direct you to Zany Mariko, who's right across the aisle there from you. We have been actively talking to students students have been actively talking to us over the course of certainly the last year, but also before that in various different ways, about how they want to be engaged in thinking about the future of the college, thinking about the college today, thinking about the various ways in which they work together, thinking about the various ways in which they think about the curriculum and what's possible in the curriculum, the plan process. At the same time, too, we are starting a pilot. We started a pilot this year, and hopefully it will grow next year, of something called First Year Forum, where first years are working together. Not all first years, but some first years are working together in a kind of group advising structure. So building some of those structures from the very beginning. And I'm happy to talk more about all that with you. You had a question? Someone had a question over here? No? Okay.
Actually, I did, and it was sort of a synthesis of a couple of questions that were just asked. I'm curious about how the school has engaged the the tumultuousness, I think, is probably not an inappropriate word to use, of the last couple of years, and in particular the last, let's say, 10 months in the United States. And I know, I mean, I can predict some of your response, which is to say that there are classes and communities, but especially with this tumultuousness, I'm well aware of the fact that so much of Bennington is student-led and student thought, but frankly, I as an adult am looking for other adults to help me understand and process what's happened in the last year, and I'm just curious about what the school has really done to lead that for the students.
So I'll say a couple of things that maybe go beyond the traditional, which we're also doing in the classroom, talking about various questions as they come up, whether it's through a class that one of our science faculty is teaching called Alternative Facts, or looking at, without a partisan leading, it's really only about how do you know when something is true, right? What are the scientific criteria for evidence? How do we think about evidence? These are things we're also doing through the libraries, doing through a range of different co-curricular lenses. We also have something at Bennington called pop-up courses. So students and faculty can propose a course that, because of course, those of you who are not steeped in academia may not know this, in general, curricula are set fairly far in advance, at least a term in advance, mostly a year in advance, in some places even longer in advance, but at Bennington it's a year or a term in advance, generally speaking. And while faculty are always teaching new courses that are engaging with what's happening in the world, we also wanted to create a mechanism, we started this a couple of years ago, to have what we call pop-ups, which means something's happening in the world that really deserves focused attention in the classroom, and there isn't a course on that because it didn't exist, a little while ago. So one example is one faculty member, Noah Coburn, who's done a lot of work in this region. When the Nepal earthquake happened a couple of years ago, he taught a pop-up with a geology faculty member. So Noah's an anthropologist. He taught a course together with a geology faculty member about earthquakes in that region and rebuilding and heritage sites and how we think about that. So just to give one example, that's something that obviously we didn't see coming. We couldn't have created a course about that, but when it happened, we did. So there's a kind of responsiveness that we use the structures that we have to generate, because I think it's important for students to have both structured and less structured opportunities to engage with these issues and questions. And I think, so we took a hard look at our curriculum over the last year or so to say what's happening out in the world, like how do we know that something's true, for example? What's a trusted source? How do we think about that? How do we verify even from a trusted source? We may trust in general this publication or this set of people or this advocacy group, but how do we understand that this particular thing that they're telling us is true, for real, exactly accurate? Is there another side to the story, et cetera, et cetera? So we want to give them those intellectual tools, but we also want to engage with the kind of community support that's required and creating venues that are outside of the curricular structures to talk with students and work with students.
I would just add one point, which is going back to the community and relatedness. I think the college has been far more involved, and students have been far more involved in the greater community outside the college than was the case in the past. The project that Mariko talked about, which was hugely important to a neighboring community, there's been substantial engagement with the Vermont legislature on the part of students. There was a wonderful project that a couple of years ago that dealt with lighting in the town of North Bennington. So it's about building community not only on this campus, but encouraging our students through the flexibility of Kappa and other initiatives on the college to have students going out into the larger community and affecting those communities as well and dealing with real people on the ground that are facing problems.
Really engaging students in the, what's going on? What do I think is going on? Is that the same thing as what's actually going on? Is what's going on different from multiple perspectives but equally true? Or is there one clear, empirical truth? And then what is it? Is there a larger system or occurrence that's a part of? And then how do I engage with that? Right? And that's where some of the community pieces that Alan described come in. So that lighting project isn't, of course, about climate change. But in order for that, I mean, talk about a big topic. Right? Yes, you should study science, and yes, you should understand the policy levers that are being engaged around climate change, but also you live in a particular place that makes a series of decisions about how to use energy. How can you engage in some of those direct actions that actually are, while small scale, they're bigger than personal individual scale. They're really community scale. So, yes. Okay, I've been told to, but I'm happy to, I'll stick around and I'm happy to answer a couple of more questions. So thank you very much for being here and enjoy the day.